Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we will look at the new server actions in Next.js 13, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. Next.js server actions are still in alpha as I'm creating this tutorial, and that means they could change, but I've had many requests to cover server actions and server mutations, so we're going to dive in. And just know that if you're watching this in the future, you should check the Next.js docs as well, because things do change. And note, this Next.js video is not for beginners. For better understanding as a beginner, you should complete the Next.js course on my channel first and have a good idea of the difference between client and server components, as well as an understanding of how revalidation works. And all of that will help you have a better understanding as we explore Next.js server actions. Okay, as I said, server actions are in alpha right now, and they're built on top of React actions. And there's a link here if you come into the docs and you're interested about React actions, it will link to those as well. But we've got here, they enable server-side data mutations. So we're talking about what server actions do. So server-side data mutations, also reduced client-side JavaScript, and finally progressively enhanced forms, which we'll talk about too. I'm in VS Code and I've opened a terminal. We're going to use the latest version of Next.js today. So I'm going to say npx create-next-app at latest. We'll press enter here, and it's probably going to ask us a few questions as we go. I'm going to call this server actions tutorial. And then yes, we'll use TypeScript, yes, ESLint, yes, Tailwind, yes for the source directory, and yes for the app router. And do I want to customize the import alias? Not really, but we can check what it's going to do if we go ahead and choose yes here. And then it's going to use the @ by default, and that's really what I want anyway. So I'll just press enter, and then it's going to install our new project. Okay, I've got the new project folder open now, and let's look at the package JSON. So the version I'm using today is Next.js 13.4.4. And if you're watching this in the future, there may be a newer version, but if you want to follow along and get the exact responses I do in this tutorial, I recommend installing this version if you don't have it. So after creating your project, if you don't have 13.4.4, you might want to open a terminal and type npm I for install and then next at 13.4.4. So this would go ahead and change your version to the one that I'm using today if you don't have 13.4.4. So now let's look at the next.config.js file. And notice the app router is no longer listed in here as experimental, and that's because it's now stable, and that's great. So once we have that, and by the way, that happened as of 13.4 as well. But now server actions, they're not even in beta yet. They're currently in alpha, so they're definitely experimental. So we need to add this to our next config where it has the experimental object, and then we say server actions true, and then go ahead and save the file. Now, today being a more advanced tutorial, I'm not going to write out every line of code. I'm going to go over some code with you. So I'm going to put my basic CRUD app, a to-do list, in place, and we'll look at how server actions work with those mutations compared to, say, what we did previously in the Next.js course that I put together in Chapter 11, where we handled mutations in a different way. Okay, we're back in VS Code, and I've added the full project, and we're ready to review. So let's just check out the main page of the project first, and you can see I'm pulling in two components, an addTodo and a to-do list. So let's go ahead and look at the addTodo component where we take advantage of a server action. So I'll open that up, and you can see we're importing a server action here from our library from an actions file. So let's look at how it's applied in this file, and then we'll look at the action itself. So here we have a form. Now, typically, we would have a client component with any type of interactivity. We kind of have islands of interactivity, if you will, inside of our applications. We can put those client components inside of server components, but we of course, make that interactivity a client component. That's what has always been the standard, but now this has changed. This is not a client component, and it does have a form, so we will have interactivity, and it will still work. Notice it's a basic form here. We just have the one input And then we have a submit button as well, and that's all there is to it. And the formAction attribute is calling the addTodo server action. So our main takeaway here is this is not a client component, and yet the form is going to work with our server action. Now, server actions can be invoked in several ways, and they list 3 here. One is the first one we have seen, using the action attribute on a form. And the other one here, the second one, is using the formAction attribute on an input type here, such as a button or an input type submit, input type image, so on, inside of a form. So you can have different server actions called from this formAction attribute if you go ahead and put it on, say, a button or something like that in your form. The third way, which we'll also look at, is with startTransition. And this uses the useTransition hook, of course, to get startTransition. So this one has to be inside of a client component as we're using a hook. And we're going to discuss more about progressive enhancement, but by using the useTransition hook and startTransition, that's going to disable progressive enhancement because it's going to require that extra JavaScript for that hook. So back in VS Code, let's look at that actions file inside of our library, our lib directory here. So here's the actions file, and here's our addTodo function. You can see it has the use server directive at the top. Now, if we didn't have an actions file, and we weren't using use server at the top, say we defined addTodo inside of the component, we would need to put that directive use server inside of this function to say, hey, this function needs to specifically be called and ran on the server. But since we have the use server directive at the top of this actions file, we don't need to put that inside of each function. So that's why you'll only see it here compared to some examples you may see that have that directive inside the function. So for the function itself, you can see it's receiving form data type here. So we have our data for addTodo, then we're getting the title. That's what we're actually getting for our to-do list here. And then we're going to fetch our to-dos. Now I'm going to run JSON server here. This IP address 127.0.0.1 just means local host, but I'm using the IP address for it. Port 3500 to-dos. And we're going to look at our db.json file that we'll have inside of our project when we get that going. It's going to use the post method. It's getting the content type application JSON, and then we're just sending a to-do. I'm giving every to-do the user ID of 1 now because that's not so important for this example. Here's the title that we're creating and that we're getting from that form data. It will always be false as far as whether it's completed or not when it's first created. And then an ID for the to-do will be assigned by our JSON server. And then finally, at the end of this function, we're calling revalidate path. And if you've gone through my Next.js course or you know how revalidation works, that means it's saying this path needs to be revalidated. And of course, that's our to-do list that's displayed right there. So that means the next time the data is requested, it will be fresh and new data. So if we look back at the docs here under server actions where it said what they provide, we can immediately see there is reduced client-side JavaScript because now we have that code for addTodo on the server in our server action. And then it also mentions progressively enhanced forms. Let's look at what that means. So progressive enhancement allows a form to function properly without JavaScript. And well, that's kind of mind-blowing in a way. That's why we're getting some comparisons now back to PHP actually. But it's very cool here in Next.js because we can also see the update even though the JavaScript is disabled. And that's what we're going to do to try it out. It says JavaScript disabled here without JavaScript or with JavaScript disabled. And of course, that's what we'll do. Then it says this allows users to interact with the form and submit data even if the JavaScript for the form hasn't been loaded, which they would call hydration, or it fails to load. So if you read further in here, they talk about hydration, and you could do this in a client component as well, or if you had other JavaScript involved in it. But of course, that JavaScript wouldn't work if you disable the JavaScript, but this server action will. Okay, we're back in VS Code, and you can see my db.json file here. It's in the top level of our file directory, just like package.json. And we're going to use JSON server to run this as our to-dos API. So I'm going to open up a terminal window, and I'll type npx json, if I could spell, JSON-server, and then put -w for watch, and we'll say watch the db.json file, and we'll say -p for port, and we'll give it 3500, /H for host, and I'll put 127.0.0.1, which is the same as localhost really, but I'm just using the IP address. So press enter, and now this should start running. It finds our to-dos, and it will log any requests here as well. So we need to open a second terminal window. And now in this terminal window, I'll drag this over, we don't need that so much, but I'm going to just do npm run dev to start our Next.js project. And this will get started on port 3000. So we have localhost 3000. We can control click that and launch the app. And here is the basic to-do list. We haven't got into the updates or the to-do component yet, but we're talking about adding a new to-do. And of course, we can just say new to-do, press enter, and it's going to add that to-do. Right now, we have JavaScript enabled though. So let's open up the dev tools with Control-Shift-I, or if you like to right-click and choose inspect or anything like that. After that, let's go ahead and go to the 3 dots up here, and then we choose Run Command. You can see you could also launch that with Control plus Shift plus P. I'll just choose Run Command. I want Disable, and Disable JavaScript comes up. So just click on that. And now you should see a little red X over here to the very right of your address bar, and that's what we're interested in. After disabling the JavaScript, let's go ahead and refresh the page just to make sure we have a current load here. We're running in dev mode, and now we have JavaScript disabled. Let's try to add something new here with our addTodo function, and I'll just put a hello, press enter, and it still works. We have no JavaScript running whatsoever right now in the browser, and our server action still works, and that's pretty cool. And that's what they're referring to as progressive enhancement. So you can still have some of that interactivity without the dependency on JavaScript, or if that JavaScript doesn't load, some things will still work. Now we're back in VS Code again. We've already looked at the addTodo with the server action that uses progressive enhancement. And now we're going to look at the to-do list, and it's pretty basic here. We're just fetching the to-dos, and then if we don't have any to-dos, we'll say no to-dos available. But if we do, we're going to reverse them just so we have the latest at the top, and we'll map through those reversed or sorted to-dos. And of course, we'll use the to-do component, and that's where it gets a little more interesting. So let's take a look at that to-do component. And I'll go ahead and press Alt-Z to wrap any code that might scroll off the screen. But in this to-do component, you can see we are importing deleteTodo from the actions file that we have in the lib directory as well. And then we're importing update checkbox. And we'll get to that in a minute, but let's look at this delete first. So as we get down into this to-do component, we can really see besides the label, which is actually holding the title of the to-do as well. So that's the part we read. Then we have the update checkbox, and we have a button that will delete the to-do. Now notice this is a form, but we're not using the formAction attribute. We're using the formAction. This is the formAction attribute. Up here, I should say it is the action attribute that would be on a form element. That's easy to confuse as you talk about the two of them, because this is a formAction attribute. So we are using this. Now this is something I didn't see represented quite so well in the docs, at least in my opinion. And that's because they just had a function that they would call by name like we previously did with addTodo. But what if you need to pass something to your function? Well, then you usually have to use another wrapper function, like an anonymous function, as you see here. And all server actions need to be asynchronous as well. So we have an async anonymous function. And then for this to work correctly, we do need to put the useServer directive inside this anonymous function. Now that's not the same as the useServer directive that is used on the deleteTodo function that is inside of our actions file. Now we already used that for deleteTodo, but still here we need this directive for this anonymous async function. And then we're just awaiting the deleteTodo right here and passing that to-do in. So this function also works with that progressive enhancement as far as a form. So we could delete something without having JavaScript enabled as well. Let's try that out. Okay, we're back in the browser. I don't know if you can see this little red X up here, but once again, JavaScript is still disabled. So let's go ahead and delete this hello to-do that we created. And if I click on the button, it just deletes it. It works without that JavaScript. So that is also a progressive enhancement for a form, and we're using that with the deleteTodo server action. Now, before we move on to the update checkbox, let's go ahead and re-enable the JavaScript, because here we're going to use a transition that we talked about, and that's going to need the JavaScript enabled. As they noted in the documentation, it will not work with progressive enhancement. So let's go back to the 3 dots and run command. Here we can type enable, and we'll see enable JavaScript come up if we have disabled it. So I'll just click on that now. And we'll probably need to refresh because it still shows it's blocked right now. So let's refresh. And yes, that red X goes away. So after you disable or re-enable your JavaScript, you should probably always refresh your app to make sure it is applied correctly. And just a quick note back here in the docs before we look at our actions file once again, and that is on server mutations. That's essentially what we're looking at with our server actions today. This is kind of a term thing just to get right in your mind, because this is a server action that mutates the data, and we're doing that when we add something, when we remove something, and especially when we update something. And then it says and calls redirect, revalidate path, or revalidate tag. And all of our server actions today are calling revalidate path at the end. And back in VS Code, we're back at the actions file. We already looked at the addTodo server action. So let's look at the deleteTodo, which isn't much different. It just gets the ID of the to-do as we send it to our JSON server. And then, of course, at the very end, it calls revalidate path. So not a whole lot that's different there. We might as well look at the updateTodo server action while we're here also. And it's very much the same. We just pass the to-do ID, and then we're, of course, putting in that updated information, which it's just flipping the completed, which is a Boolean, so it's the opposite of what it was before, and we have revalidate path at the end. So very simple functions overall, and you've probably seen a to-do list before, but these are our server actions. Now let's go back to that update checkbox component that's in our components directory. So let's look at how this is applied with useTransition. And you can see right away it has the use client directive at the top. And that's because we need client-side JavaScript here for any hook we would use, like useTransition. Now, a client component can still call a server action, and we're importing our updateTodo server action right here. So as I scroll just a little bit, you can see we apply the useTransition hook, and then we get isPending from the hook as well as startTransition. You can use the isPending part of useTransition in a disabled attribute if you want to. So it will just be disabled essentially while the transition is taking place. Now for a checkbox, we're using the onChange. And you can see here we have an anonymous function that then starts the transition, which then itself has an anonymous function. And then inside of that, we call the updateTodo and pass the to-do in. Now notice we're using startTransition here. We don't need to await the updateTodo as we did previously with our other function. But this is the third way of calling a server action, as they said in the docs, because here we're having a custom invocation, and essentially that's what you need to do with a checkbox. So this will need the JavaScript enabled, but then it should work in our app. So let's take a look. Okay, we're back in the browser. I can close DevTools now as we have JavaScript enabled, and now we're just working with the checkbox here. So we can check, and it unchecks the box. Now let's see if that's saved in our JSON server data. So if I refresh, will we get the same data? Yes. So it was successful. And of course, you could check your DB.json file as well to see if that changed. We can check it once again, and it once again saves that data. So when it reloads, it's now checked. And this works great. And it will continue to work great as long as we're on a single page. But when we go to a second page that might edit the same data and we come back to this page or go back to that page, things can get out of sync. We need to remember that we're working with server actions here. Everything we're changing is the data on the server. We're not keeping any type of client-side state here, and that could cause a problem. Let me show you what I mean. So we can go to any one of the edit pages. So if I went to the new to-do page here, and now I check that this is complete, and I go back, it's still not complete here on the main list page. If I go that page, it does say it's complete. So now we have a problem. And that's because, one, we're revalidating this path when we have that, but not the other path. But the other issue is what I was talking about. We are working with that data on the server, but it's kind of a little known thing that Next.js does have a client-side cache, And you need to know the difference between hard and soft navigation. Hard navigation will go ahead and grab fresh data. Soft navigation is going to use cache data as it goes between pages. And that is actually what the next link does. It uses soft navigation unless we clear that client-side cache. So that could be an issue if we're changing data on one page and then linking to another. And if you want an even deeper dive on that, I go into quite a bit of detail about that in the 11th chapter of my Next.js course that's on my channel. So now we're back in VS Code and we're going to apply a fix so we can work with this data on two separate pages. So let's scroll to the top of this file. I'm going to comment out the useTransition usage so it will still be there in the code if you want to refer to that or switch this component back to using the startTransition. But let's go ahead and apply what I'm going to now, and I'm going to do a couple of different imports here. Alt-Z to wrap that down. One you can see is the experimental useFormStatus hook, and the other one is the useRouter hook from Next Navigation. And then underneath, I'll comment out where we defined these isPending and the startTransition from useTransition, and instead we're going to define a router with useRouter, and we can get pending from useFormStatus. So the easy change down here is instead of using isPending, we can just use pending from that useFormStatus inside of our disabled attribute. And now I'm going to comment out this onChange line just so you can keep the startTransition here inside of the source code that you might want to refer to. And I'll put in a different onChange line here. This is going to once again use an async anonymous function. And then inside of this, we don't need to use the useServer directive because we're not making this anonymous function a server action. We're just using a server action inside of it. So I'm going to await our updateTodo and pass in to-do, and this will still call our updateTodo server action. And after that, I'm going to use router.refresh. And the reason I'm using this, and I'll put a note here, is it updates the client-side cache in Next. And that's something I went into detail on in that chapter 11 of my Next.js course, because at the time, that was something that they just had in a Canary version, and I showed how it was going to work in the future, and we actually used that Canary version a little bit, which is, of course, something they're still experimenting with and haven't released yet. Now, it's available here in this version of Next.js. So when we call router refresh, even that soft navigation that we'll use to go back to our list from the edit page should update, and we should see the new data. Back in the browser now, I'm going to refresh just to make sure everything's up to date. We can check the new to-do, and on the edit page, it has the same as it does on the list. So let's go to that edit page again, and let's uncheck our new to-do. And now let's go back to our list. And on our main list, it is also unchecked. And that's because we're using our next link navigation right here when I click Next To-Dos, and it takes us back to the home page, as well as when I click on New To Do, and it takes us to this page. So back on this page, if I click check, and then it's done, I guess is what that would mean on our to-do list. We've completed it. Let's go ahead and look, and it's completed on the edit page here as well. If I uncheck, it's unchecked here. So likewise, if I check here, it should be checked there. And if I uncheck here, it should be unchecked. So everything is working as expected now. However, did you notice, I don't know if you can tell or not on my screen, but there's just a slight bit of lag when I check the box. I click and then it happens. And that's because this is hitting the server for that information. We're not using an optimistic update. We're not seeing something on our page first as then we would send the request and see if it was successful. That's what an optimistic update is we go ahead and change it in our UI, that's our user interface, and then if it's successful, everything stays the way it is. If it's unsuccessful, it will revert those changes. There is a way to apply that, and that would make it just a little snappier so we wouldn't see that delay. I think there you could actually see me click when it's checked, and then it disappears in just a split second later. And of course, that could be longer if you're not running this local dev server. So let's go ahead and apply an optimistic update as well. Back in VS Code, in our update checkbox component, we have one more import to now use at the top, and that's going to be the useOptimistic hook that is now available. And you can find documentation about this, although there's not much right now, but you can find it on that server actions page in the docs. Hopefully in the future, there will be some more examples. I'm going to use something that's simpler than the example that they actually show in the docs. So scrolling down where we begin to use our other hooks after we've imported useOptimistic, we can apply it here. Now this looks a little complicated at first, so let me break it down. So we have our optimistic to-do because we are passing in a to-do to our update checkbox component right here that you see. So this will represent that to-do, but it's an optimistic to-do. And then we have addOptimistic to-do, which is a function. And if we look at the type, if we break this down here and come down, it's actually a reducer here, I believe. We have the pass-through of the to-do, then the reducer. So you could do something more complex, and we may do something dedicated to optimistic updates in the future, maybe a video about that. But right now, this should be fairly easy to apply for our to-dos. So our state is a to-do, and that's being passed in first. That's that pass-through data. And then what is changing is just that completed field that's a Boolean. So all I'm doing here, which would be really the reducer function that's receiving these, because this was the state before. So here's the beginning of the reducer function. And then inside the reducer function, I'm just creating a new object here for the to-do. So we're spreading the state, which was the previous to-do, then we're overriding the completed. But now in our JSX, we're going to need to change a couple of things too. One would be our checked line here. So I'm going to comment out the previous one and I'll put in the new one. Now we're going to use the optimistic to-do data. So we'll have optimistic to-do.completed instead of to-do.completed, because this is what is displayed inside the UI. So that's important. Now inside the onChange here, we're going to use that optimistic or addOptimistic to-do function, and we're just going to make it the opposite of the to-do completed. Now here we're using the original to-do because this isn't data that is displayed. The optimistic part is what we want to essentially display before we send the update to do server action here. So we're adding the optimistic to do first into the UI, then we're calling the server action, and then finally we're refreshing that client-side cache here. So let's save this, and now let's go back to see our app in the browser. Okay, we're back in the browser. I'm going to give it another refresh just to make sure we have everything the way we expect it. And now when I click New To Do, it should be fast, and it is. There's no wait at all. So we're essentially applying that check mark before the request is sent. And if it's successful, which it is, then it stays. If it's not successful, it should revert. At least that's my understanding of how this useOptimistic hook should work. And I hope to find more information and examples on that soon. This is all very new. Remember, these server actions, the server mutations, are all in alpha right now, so things can change. So I guess the last thing I would say is always go back and check that documentation. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.